A lot of talks these days start with the slide. Oh yeah, it's not going to update immediately. Extolling the virtues of neural networks and how great they are in application. This is an example of Google's neural machine translation and how close it is ostensibly to human translation performance. So I'm trying to understand how I guess the laser pointer is not going to work on the screen. Okay, great, that's fine. I'll deal with that. So at least according to these evaluations, it looks like neural networks have led to great progress in NLP. And specifically in language modeling, we have language models that are significantly better in terms of perplexity than language models that we had only a few years ago. This is an example of an n-gram model, one of the best n-gram models we had a few years ago, got a perplexity of 67 on this corpus, and an enormous Google language model got a perplexity of 30 on the same corpus. So that seems pretty impressive. But what do we really know about those RNN language models? Well, not that much. We can, if you look at the papers, you can sometimes get samples from those models. This is a pretty reasonable looking sentence that is a sample from the model. About 800 people gathered at Hever Castle in Long Beach from noon to 2 p.m. 3 to 4 times that of the funeral quartet. That's a reasonable sentence. Maybe it could be better in some ways, but it's still quite impressive. Yeah, that's the important question here. That's what this talk is going to be about. Where is Hever Castle? Yeah, okay.
Probably Scotland.
Yeah. So we get samples that qualitatively seem good. And we have a perplexity. So we know that RNNs on average can predict the next word better than n-gram models. But that doesn't really tell us about what it is exactly that the model is using to make good predictions on average. And predictions on the next word can be successful prediction can be due to successful memorization of collocations or a good grasp of the semantics of the topic, which words tend to occur together in the same sentence, or they can be due to syntax. But just looking at the samples or the perplexity doesn't tell us what it is that the model is learning. So my goal today is to go beyond perplexity, which I argue, and is maybe common sense to argue, is affected mostly by frequent phenomena. So things that tend to occur in most sentences have an outsized effect on perplexity, but are not necessarily informative about the abilities of the model, which can come through sometimes only in less frequent phenomena. Because it tends to be the case that at least syntactically, which is going to be the focus on this talk on syntax, frequent phenomena tend to be quite simple. So most sentences don't have relative clauses that are complex and interesting and informative about the abilities of the language model. So I'm going to try to come up with better tools to measure the syntactic sophistication of a language model, though I thought I fixed this typo, of a language model. But I think that this general approach can apply to other domains as well, including semantics, and maybe I'll give an example at the end. And having the ability to compare different language model architecture on a particular interpretable phenomenon, I think what can give us a much better sense of progress in language modeling, because it can tell us what it is that the new architecture is buying us compared to previous architectures. And it could very well be the case that two architectures will have similar perplexity, but have complementary strength in terms of the kinds of things that they're good at predicting. So there are 5 different projects that I wanted to touch on today in different extensive detail. So first of all, just as a background about this methodology, I'll say a little bit about my work with Emmanuel Dupuy and Yoav Goldberg here, using the subject-verb agreement task as a case study for how you can use a specific syntactic phenomenon to get insight into what a language model is learning. And then I'll talk about some more recent work from this year. One tries to control for semantics and focus specifically on syntax. Make sure that the prediction that we're making are really due to syntax as opposed to semantics using colorless green ideas sentences. This is a Chomsky reference. I was told that I should say that in some contexts. And then I will, what's that?
You're on the West Coast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then I will talk about a new data set that we recently created that's supposed to kind of raise the bar and push the syntactic evaluation further than we can do with sentences sampled from a corpus. And then a couple of other recent projects. One is using a phenomenon of syntactic priming to probe the representations of language model. This is, for those who don't know what syntactic priming is from psycholinguistics, I will explain that. I think it's a cool trick. I managed to do that. Yeah, and here the preview is that by LSTMs that are trained to do NLI and get pretty good accuracy on average on this task, maybe 80%, if you test them on the right sentences, their accuracy drops to 0%, which is not a good accuracy. Okay, so these are the projects. We can go, based on what people are interested in, we can spend more time on some or on others. Okay, so why this fixation on subject-verb agreement? So I don't think that subject-verb agreement per se is the most important thing that a language model should do necessarily. I think there are a lot of interesting syntactic phenomena to look at. We chose this phenomenon because it's convenient and frequent enough to find in a corpus, but also is informative about the language model syntactic representations. So why do we think it's important? It's informative. Suppose that you have a sentence like the key to the cabinets is on the table, and you're trying to figure out if the verb should be is or are, if is the correct verb here or are is. If all you have is the sequence of words in the sentence, this is not such a trivial task because you know that the verb has to agree with one of the nouns of the sentence, but which of those nouns is it supposed to agree with? Is it supposed to agree with cabinets or with table or with key? And intuitively, at least, that cabinet seems to be the most plausible noun to agree with because it's right next to the verb, so why not just agree with that noun? So if you only have as a representation of the sequence of words in the sentence, it's not trivial at all to perform this task. However, if you have a structured representation of the sort that we are used to in linguistics, we meaning me and other people, not me and you, is that if you have a tree that represents the syntax of the sentence, you can come up with an extremely simple algorithm to conjugate the verb here. You find the subject of the sentence, which is just the NP directly under the S node, and then you find its head, which in most cases is simple, and that's it. That's the end of the algorithm. Based on the number of the head, you know whether the verb should be singular or plural. And this algorithm doesn't even consider the nouns table or cabinets. So this is the classic case in which having the correct representation makes the algorithm trivial. But in RNN language models, we don't have those representations. So if they are able to conjugate the verb anyway, without having those representations, at least not built into them before we start training them, then it means that they have learned quite a bit about syntax, or the syntax of English, without having that syntax be part of the supervision or part of the structure of the model. So how do we operationalize this challenge, the conjugation challenge? In this work, we give the model these are photos of Yoav. You can also look at him. He's right here. And here, the photos are gone. So, yeah. So if we give the model the first few words of the sentence, let's say that the first few words are the length of the forewings, and then we tell the model the next word is going to be a verb. Is that verb going to be singular or plural? And then in this case, the model is supposed to predict singular, and in this case, the model is supposed to predict plural. And the first few words that lead up to the verb are called the preamble. This is a classic task in psycholinguistics. Usually in psycholinguistics, people don't need to say singular or plural, but they need to produce a specific verb, such as is or are. But that's a very small difference. And well, the reason it's a useful task in psycholinguistics is that it is used to study syntactic representations in humans. So given that humans and neural networks pose some of the same challenges when we come to study them, that there are black box, and we have to come up with these behavioral these tricks to study what they know based on their behavior rather than by analyzing their internal representations. So that's kind of an example of how it's useful to use the same tasks for studying neural networks as well. All right, this is maybe the last manifesto point for the talk, so the rest will be more technical. Okay, so in this paper, we actually didn't focus on analyzing language models. We did have a little bit on language models, but we took a very simplifying approach. So instead of having the RNN learn to predict the next word at each step, we have it read the full preamble and then make a prediction at the end, whether the verb should be singular or plural. So this is the kind of you have one job type of situation. And well, the goal behind that is we want to give the RNN the best shot it can to learn this syntactic phenomenon. And this is trained in a supervised way. So we, oh yeah, of course, each of those boxes is a little LSTM. So this is trained in a supervised way. We take a bunch of sentences from Wikipedia that have at least one agreeing verb. So most or many verbs in English don't actually agree with their subject. So only present tense, third person verbs agree with their subject. So we find sentences like that in Wikipedia. And then we cut them at one of the verbs. So a lot of sentences have multiple verbs. We just randomly choose one of them, and then we cut the sentence up to that. In the original work, we trained on 100,000 sentences and tested on 1 million. We wanted to have interesting sentences in the test set. That's crucial. I'll show you why. This is a pretty small model, kind of a toy model. And this is a word level model, so it doesn't have representation of the morphology of the words. Okay, and let's see what the results were. I'm going through this work a little bit more quickly because it's not as new anymore, and I want to talk about the new stuff. But I hope that it's clear, and if it's not, feel free to ask me questions about it. So let's see what the results were. This is the error rate on the y-axis. So these are the simple baseline. If the model is choosing singular or plural at random, we expect 50% accuracy. If it's always saying singular, which is the majority class, we expect 32% error rate. Just most of the verbs in English are singular. And when we train our actual model, we got 0.8% error. That's really good, right? That's very impressive. So the RNN almost never makes errors. But the issue is that a lot of the sentences of English are quite simple. And in fact, if you only have one noun in your sentence, if the sentence is the boy smiles, then you don't have to have a very sophisticated representation of syntax to know that the boy is the noun that you should be agreeing with because there's only one noun. And it's more common than you would think in English. So looking at the average sentence doesn't necessarily tell us that much about what the model knows about syntax or about anything else. What I argue is that you should focus on sentences that you think are going to be challenging to the model in a way that is theoretically interpretable. You understand why they're challenging because you know linguistics. And so what we did in this study, we sampled sentences that from the corpus, real sentences from the corpus that we thought would be challenging. So instead of looking at sentences where there's only one noun, we try to find sentences in which there is more than one noun, and there is a noun that interferes between the subject and the verb that has the opposite number from the subject, from the head of the subject. So here, if you were using a heuristic that's based on recency, agreeing with the most recent noun, you will always make an error here. And we have, I guess this is part of it is based on the intuition that RNNs tend to have this bias to look at more recent stuff. We have some other recent work that suggests that they definitely do have this bias. I can talk about it later. Okay, so and you can find, in the corpus you can find sentences like that. You can find sentences with more than one of these nouns, which we call attractors, because they attract the agreement features away from the verb or something. It's not our name. So you can find sentences like that. They're not common at all. And the more attractors you try to find, the less common they get in the corpus. But you can find them. And you can sample based on their complexity rather than based on the frequency in the corpus, which is the important thing to do, I argue. And we didn't look at dependencies where the noun in the middle was not the opposite number of the head of the subject, because it's not interpretable what it means if the model succeeds here, because it could be agreeing with either the recent noun or the head of the subject. We also ruled out excluded dependencies that are mixed. So this is maybe clear, but maybe not, but I'll say it explicitly. We're evaluating the same model that we were evaluating before. The model is still trained on all sentences. Just for evaluation for the test set, we are sampling difficult sentences. So this is important. I find it's less interesting to train the model only on difficult sentences because it's not that kind of implicitly gives it a supervision that we found less plausible. So what we want to be able to do is to take a model that's kind of off the shelf and evaluate it on these challenging sentences. Yes?
I was wondering if you had sentences with lists like the key, the lock, and the cabinet are nested, where all the nouns are singular, but you
Yeah.
produce
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't have, we excluded these from our study, I think. So, but that's a good question. So there are cases in which it's not so clear what the head of the subject is that you're supposed to agree with with the verb. So you can say that the head of the subject phrase is the conjunction or something. But yeah, that's a good point. There are there are complications like that. There are other cases such as a number of people were in the room. So there are a lot of infrequent cases in English where there isn't one noun that determines the number of the verb. I'm simplifying it here.
And one more quick one. I know you're talking only about English, but languages where the agreement is also based on gender,
Yeah.
or even pragmatic things like social role and things like that. Have you looked at those?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes. So that's more of we do have a little bit of work on other languages as well. In fact, we have this recent paper that we've been working on in which we try to create synthetic languages, thousands of different languages in principle that have all of the different typological properties that you could imagine. But yes, this is a very interesting direction to see how languages vary from each other in agreement and other syntactic properties, and see how that affects how RNNs are able to learn their syntax. Yeah, great question. Okay, so let's see how the model does on these difficult sentences. Again, this is error rate on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, how many attractors you had in the dependencies. Again, the sizes of these bins are very different from each other. So the vast majority of the sentences have 0 attractors. And these are the baselines that I mentioned before. And here's the how the model performed. So you can get, in sentences with multiple attractors, you can get much higher error rate than in sentences with 0 attractors. So you get up to almost 20% errors in this case, compared to 0.5% errors. So we can reliably trick the model to make incorrect predictions. However, notice that it's still making the correct prediction more often than chance, and definitely more often than you would expect if it were just relying on the recency heuristic, where you just agree with the most recent noun, in which case it would make 100% errors. So just to drive that point home a little bit more, we looked at a baseline that we call the noun-only baseline, in which the input is only the nouns of the sentence. So you don't get any of the function words, which typically indicate the syntactic structure of the sentence. And we expect that this model would not be able to learn a lot of syntax because it is handicapped in a way that just it doesn't have it in its input. And let's see how this model did. Whoop. Yeah. So if you train this the same architecture but with impoverished input, the model makes many more errors. And in fact, on complex sentences, it makes many more errors than chance, which suggests that this model does learn the agree with the most recent noun heuristic. So just to summarize, this indicates that LSTMs are actually able to use syntactic cues to overcome this recency bias, which is quite impressive. But still, error rates increase gradually up to a much higher level than they were in simpler sentences. Yeah, so there were a few questions here. Yeah.
So do you have other baselines besides random guess? And what do those look like? So non-neural baselines.
Non-neural baselines. Nope. But what would you propose?
I don't know. Random guess is it's a pretty extreme baseline.
Right.
You have something that's slightly more clever than that, but not as good. Like, did you try this parsing algorithm that you introduced in the beginning, where you just take a parse tree and?
Oh. Yeah, that's a good question. I would hope that error rate there would be 0, but yeah, but maybe not. Yeah, it would be interesting to try a PCFG language model. But that wouldn't be a baseline. That's almost like an oracle, because that's a model that's trained with supervised syntax, and so it's hard to compare.
It's only the parser, not the algorithm, because the parser may or may not pick right.
Mm-hmm.
And also we don't know when it is right? So it might kind of, if we trust the parser always, then and because it's like on unknown premises, we don't have the actual parser.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit tricky.
Right. Yeah, that's another good point. Yeah.
On this like reduced version, are you training it on the reduced version or just testing it on keys cabinets?
Yeah, I'm training it also. Yeah. Yeah.
Is this still the binary classification?
Yeah. I'm going to switch to language modeling in a second.
So
Yeah.
this seems to suggest that for 4 attractors, if I just take the opposite decision from choosing the most recent attractor, I actually get 20% error.
Yeah, if you're on the blue curve.
No, that means
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you've got a classifier which is worse than
Yeah.
random. So
If
it's
you
just,
know it's an attractor though, so you have to know that you are in this position.
Right. I mean, the interesting thing is that when you, I also agree that it's interesting that a model performs worse than chance, but I think what that indicates is that the model is not selecting the number of the verb at random. It's using a strategy that is wrong, but it's using it consistently. So which is kind of interesting.
you could have an algorithm here which counts the nouns and takes the opposite of your classifier.
Right.
So it's definitely possible to know you're in a scenario, right?
No, because you can have many nouns, and actually the last one will agree. So if you knew which one you should agree with, then you can count, but then you don't have count.
So this is more problem with the data that you have.
Mm-hmm.
This is just
Yeah.
likely that in the case that you have more than 4 nouns, the most recent one actually doesn't agree.
Well, I don't know if that is the way that the model chooses to represent the sentence. So what you're suggesting is that when you train a model in an unsupervised way, what it would learn is to count the nouns in the sentence and decide whether the verb should be plural or singular based on how many nouns occurred so far. But I don't know if that's the strategy that it's using. It's definitely an incorrect strategy, as you have pointed out, but I don't know if that's what it's doing. I think that what I think it's doing is based on it's generalizing from simple sentences in which there's only one noun to more complex sentences that are less frequent, so they don't affect the loss function as much. And but this is an incorrect generalization to make. And the reason, so there is, well, anyway, I don't want to talk about this too much because I do want to get to the other studies. But yeah, we can talk about it more later. Okay, yes.
Sorry, last question. When in the case where you have multiple attractors,
Mm-hmm.
do you look into the prediction and take into account the distance from the attractor? So is it always picking the closest attractor and agreeing to that one, or how does that?
Yeah. So in these dependencies, all of the nouns in the middle had the wrong number, the misleading number. So they were all plural, where the subject was supposed to be singular. So it would be hard to tell which of those nouns were tricking the model. But yeah, maybe if we added some attention to this model, which yeah, it would be a good idea. We can see which of those nouns were the misleading ones. But yeah, it's a good suggestion. All right, so this is the goal of this study was to show that when you average over a randomly sampled sentences, a set of randomly sampled sentences, which often tend to be very simple, that can lead to overly optimistic conclusions. So this is on a log scale, the number of dependencies that have 0 attractors versus 1, 2, 3. So most of the sentences in the corpus don't have this problem at all. Right? And then you have 100 sentences with 5 attractors. This is out of 1 million. Right? So, and attractors are also kind of not necessarily the most complex syntactic structure that you can look at it. Just kind of an easy way we had to sample sentences from the corpus. So you get this overall accuracy of 0.8%, which masks the fact that when you look at challenging sentences, you get up to 20% error rate. So I will say a few words about this study that I can also talk about for an hour. There's a lot of stuff in it, where we we're going back to language modeling now. It's not this supervised training scenario anymore where we train specifically to predict the number of the verb. So how do we evaluate subject-verb agreement in a language model, right? So it's not explicitly part of the prediction of the model whether the verb should be singular or plural. So what we do is give the language model the first few words of the sentence and then look at the probability distribution of the next word and compare the probability of the word that in fact occurred in the corpus, the correct verb, to the opposite, to the same verb in the opposite number. So compare was to were. There are other ways to do it. You can also sum all of the singular verbs and all the plural verbs, but in some experiments they were kind of equivalent, and this is what we decided to go with. So in this study, we actually did a cross-linguistic comparison. It was Wikipedia, but on 4 languages: English, Russian, Hebrew, and Italian. I'm not going to say that much about the comparison between the languages because it wouldn't have time. This is work with Christina Gulordava, who's an intern at Facebook. And what she did was look at a dependency parsed corpus. This is from the Universal Dependency Tree Bank. And she found sentences in each of the languages that had nested dependencies, such that you have the agreement dependency between the girl goes, but then in the middle you have the girl the boys like often goes. And then you can find, so in English you have this mostly with noun with subject-verb agreement, but in other languages you have different kinds of agreement. So in Russian, for example, you have agreement between the adjective and the noun. Right? If the noun is plural, the adjective also has to be plural. And you can, yeah. So this is one extension of the study where we look at a number of different languages. But maybe one of the coolest parts of this study is that we tried to make sure that the model's success on the agreement task really reflects syntactic abilities rather than other sources of information that you can use to make the prediction task. So what I am referring to is that in sentences like the angry brown dog that sit by the cat bark or barks fiercely. Right? So here the correct number is bark. It should be bark and not barks. But you can solve this task based only on the plausibility of the dependency. Right? So you know that cats don't bark. The only thing that can bark in the sentence is dogs, so you choose to agree with that. And that doesn't mean that you're parsing the sentence and figuring out its structure. It could mean that you are memorizing dependency between specific verb and specific nouns, or more generally semantic plausibility relationships, which is great, which is something that your model should learn. But if you want to have an interpretable experiment, you want to make sure that you're controlling for confounds. So what we did is create sentences that are kind of crazy sentences where you take each of the content words in the original sentence from the corpus and switch them out for another word from the same part of speech. So you get sentences that don't make any sense, like this sentence. The colors of green ideas sit by the door, sleep furiously. And the only way that you can decide whether the verb is sleep or sleeps is if you know what the structure of the sentence is, right? Because ideas are as likely to sleep as honor is, or whatever. Yeah. So yeah. So this is maybe a stronger test for whether your model is using syntax to make these predictions. And we looked at some some baselines, an n-gram baseline, and a baseline we called 5-gram LSTM, which is an LSTM that gets only the last 4 words when it makes the prediction. So it has all of the embedding and generalization abilities of an LSTM, but doesn't have access to context, to longer range context. And here are the results. So in red, the original sentences from the corpus, and in blue, the sentences that we created. So there are two things that I would point out. One is that if you look at the LSTM, its accuracy is somewhat lower when you go to the nonce sentences that we created, but it's not that much reduced. And that's compared to the n-gram models, which are obviously not going to be able to solve this task, because even if the context that you need is relatively local, you have never seen the n-gram, the idea sleeps in your corpus. So you're just not going to be able to do this. But the other thing that's interesting here is that even the LSTM's accuracy is not spectacular. So we're here at, I guess, 80%. So we, here we selected sentences that we know had intervening dependencies between the subject and the verb, or whatever 2 items we were supposed to look at the dependency of. So it's not doing amazingly, but it's definitely using syntax to do what it is doing. So again, this is just the highlights from this paper. There's a lot to say about it. But one cool thing that we did in this paper was compare the language model's predictions to the predictions of human subjects. We only did this in Italian. And the reason that's interesting is that sometimes the level of performance that you can expect from your model is actually not 100%. Because sometimes there are sentences, especially in Italian, where you just can't tell whether the verb should be singular or plural, just based on the sentence. So for example, sometimes the number, I think that maybe has to do with what you asked before. Sometimes whether the verb is singular or plural is determined by the previous sentence, or by discourse factors. Or in Italian, you sometimes have the word order reversed. So you say something like, and then appeared a man. So again, you wouldn't be able, when you see the verb, you wouldn't be able to know whether it's supposed to be singular or plural. So that's one of the reasons we ran the human subject comparison here. And here, in Italian at least, the humans did better than the language models overall, but not by that much. So this is, overall, the language models are performing respectably in this task. Yes?
Sorry, I missed what's original in nouns, actually.
So original are the real sentences from the corpus, and and nouns are the ones with the green, colorless green ideas that we, okay, yeah. So maybe it wasn't necessary to go back. Okay, so these are just teasers for this paper. You should go and read it. I really don't have time to talk about it at length. So now I want to talk about a different direction that we've been taking this evaluation approach. So first of all, I want to convince you, this is a nice paper that was presented at EMNLP that I think is a really nice demonstration of that this sort of evaluation is useful to compare different language models. So what they did in this paper was compare recurrent language models based on LSTMs and an attention-only language model like based on the transformer idea. And they trained both of these language models on the same corpus and got very similar perplexities. The perplexity of the attention model is maybe slightly higher, but you wouldn't say that these models are substantially different from each other. But then when they tested it specifically on these complex subject-verb agreement dependencies, they actually found pretty significant differences between the two models, which I obviously thought was cool because it is what we argued should be the case, but we didn't really have evidence that that does happen occasionally. So this is a nice case in which the two models that overall make roughly similar predictions in terms of perplexity differ significantly in the predictions that they make for complex sentences. So here for the RNN, you have 92% accuracy, and for the attention model, you have 70-something% accuracy. So you make 3 times as many errors on the 4 attractor sentences. So this looks like something that can help us distinguish different language models that are difficult to distinguish just based on perplexity. And this is the same speech that I gave before, how if you just average over random sentences, you are not going to be able to, the sentences that are in the long tail that are more complex are not really going to affect your conclusions. So what the direction that we went in this study was to, instead of trying to sample difficult sentences from a corpus, which gets increasingly difficult as the phenomena that you're interested in are increasingly infrequent, we decided to construct the data set ourselves. That also directly controls for the semantic confounds that we mentioned before. So we don't have to construct crazy sentences like green ideas sleep furiously. We can just make sure that the sentences we construct don't have those semantic confounds and any other distance-based confound and so on. So we could just run experiments on our models that are as controlled as the experiments that we would run in psycholinguistics. And this is work by Becky Marvin, a student at Hopkins. So we can, this is an example of the kind of sentences that we construct. They're somewhat strange in the sense that there aren't a lot of sentences like this in the corpus, where you have two full noun phrases, both of which are animate. It just doesn't happen that often, but they're not as weird as the colorless green idea sentences. And here the logic is the same logic. We construct a sentence with an attractor, but we make sure that all the attractors in this condition are in a specific type of clause. Here it's an object relative clause. And we made sure that all the nouns were animate, and all the verbs are verbs that are plausible with either of those nouns. So bankers can see, bankers can be tall, and authors can see and can be tall. So there are no semantic cues here. So this really purely tests whether you can figure out the fact that the words in the middle, who the banker sees, are a relative clause that you're supposed to ignore when you calculate agreement between authors and R. So we can go through and generate thousands of sentences like that from templates. We can look at other phenomena, except for subject-verb agreement, that are argued in linguistics to be sensitive to structure. So with reflexive anaphora, we have the same issue. A reflexive pronoun can only agree with a noun that's in the same clause and not with a noun that's in the embedded clause. So you can't say the manager that the architects like doubted themselves to mean that the architects doubted the managers. So it has to be this has to be that the architects doubted themselves. That's the only way that you can use this pronoun. So we can go through and come up with a lot of examples like this. We had maybe 15 different cases. And now we tested a number of different language models on those cases that we constructed. So the first language model is a human language model, just comparing to giving humans the two sentences and asking them which one looks better to you. And then we trained a number of language models on a Wikipedia corpus, a trigram language model, and an LSTM, like a pretty large one, and an LSTM that has a multitask objective, both language modeling and CCG super tagging. The idea here is that if you give a model 2 tasks, and it will learn a representation that is good for performing both of those tasks, and then you can have synergy such that being good at CCG super tagging will make you better at syntactic predictions in your language model. So you just take both of these prediction tasks and you add the objective functions together. So let's see what our results were. I'll briefly show you this scary table, and then I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we looked at simple sentences, such as the man smiles or the men smile, so the RNNs did very well. The humans also did. Maybe no surprises here. But when we go to more complex sentences, such as the one with object relative clauses that I showed before, we get humans are slightly worse, but they're still above 80%. But the performance of the RNN is much, much lower here. So it's actually, in some cases, close to 50% accuracy, which is quite surprising because these are not long sentences. I wasn't expecting it to be this bad. And if you, the multitask model actually performs significantly better than the model that's only trained on language modeling. But still, it doesn't always help, and it doesn't bring it to the level of humans. This was a phenomenon in which it was able to perform as well as humans. But yeah. So just to give you some examples, here is a case. The simple agreement case is maybe not so surprising that both the RNN and the humans did very well. Also, if the agreement is inside a sentential complement. So this is a more complex sentence, and in principle, you would think that the model would want to, the verb laughs to sometimes agree with the main clause subject mechanics, but it's doing very well. It's never being misled here. But in these types of sentences with a relative clause in the middle, the RNN did very poorly. So relative clauses are hard, and there, I guess, aren't that many of them in the corpus to learn from, and there aren't that many of them when you test the model, so you just don't know that your RNN is not good at relative clauses. Whether it's important for an RNN to be good at relative clauses, that's a different question, but I think it is. So it looks like, from this data set at least, it looks like we are able to trick the RNN quite easily. So we actually thought we would have to go to more complex sentences than the ones that we ended up with. And even though multitask learning with the syntactic task helped a little bit, it didn't quite solve it. So it looks like we need, if we want to be able to have a language model that's as good at syntax as humans are, we would need to have richer inductive biases, or maybe train our language models on additional objectives. But just parsing and language modeling is not enough to get us to the level of humans on this task. So there's a question here. Which one do you believe? Do you believe the results on the corpus or the results on the controlled, constructed materials? I think that we want the model to be able to do well on the constructed materials as well, because humans are able to do it, so why not? But yeah, that's obviously philosophical differences here. Yes?
Well, I think another question to ask is, are word representations good? I mean, it could just be that starting from the assumption that you're dealing with words is bad. Have you tried this thing with sub-word representations? Or things
Yeah,
like
a little bit. So I would say that I'm not too concerned about the quality of the word representations, because we use the same words in the simple sentences and the complex sentences. So the fact that we are able to perform the agreement task very well on simple sentences suggests that the model knows which words are singular and which words are plural. But I do agree that generalizing from frequent words to infrequent words would require knowing something about the morphology of English, and that a word that ends with an S is likely to be plural. But I don't think that this explains the performance of the model here. Yeah, but I think in our recent work we have looked at character-based inputs, right? Hybrid word level and character-based, which we thought would be, so this was work on morphologically rich languages, right? So we thought it would be necessary. Yes?
I'm trying to understand the degree to which this is like a problem really with RNN or necessarily a problem with domain adaptation, right? Because it's like, if you're putting in your own corpus of sentences, it's hard to tease those things that aren't necessarily. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, that's a good question. As I mentioned, if you look at a corpus, it's very rare that you have two animated noun phrases introduced in the same sentence. That's just kind of a fact about discourse structure, that people like to introduce one new noun phrase per sentence. So maybe that is already a problem for the RNN. I would say that if that's a problem for the RNN, it's disappointing. That's not what I want. I don't want the RNN to. I want the RNN to generalize from the sentences that it's exposed to my test sentences, because humans are able to generalize in that way.
Yeah,
But I agree that that is one way to characterize the problem. I still think it's a problem, though.
But so the way you said it, I feel like implies a conclusion, which is specifically that RNN fails to generalize.
Yeah.
But I think there's other explanations, which is like, it's not the structure, which is the RNN, it's the training procedure, which is something else.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like there's different things to use
Right.
and chain.
Okay. Oh no, I'm absolutely. So, but I think that just because this particular structure didn't occur as is in the training corpus, is that doesn't seem to be a good excuse for failing, because that's what it means to generalize. But what do you have in mind when you say training procedure? It's not just the corpus?
Yes, it's not just a corpus,
Yeah.
results don't necessarily. One other question is, does this generalize to all possible RNNs training
Yeah.
of that structure type training? Which I know is like an impossible question to answer, but
Yeah. Yeah. No,
That's
that's a good question. So I'm not. I guess the main point of this work is not this particular paper is not so much to argue against RNNs and say that RNNs are bad. It's more a challenge to any sort of language model that you propose or training objective that you propose. This is something that humans are able to do, and the particular language models that we tested weren't able to do. So maybe your training procedure will be able to do it. But I encourage you to try that with whatever procedure you think is better than the baselines we tried. OK, so there are two other things that I could talk about. Oh, yeah, here's the question. What is the problem that it has with relative clauses? I have some analysis slides that I can show, but we're not actually going to get to them. So I think I can just briefly tell you what these two other projects are. I can do each one of them in just a couple of minutes, I think. So we talked about adaptation, actually. So this is a project on language model adaptation and how we can use it to study the representations in the language model. So, well, we all know why adaptation is a good idea. Different contexts have different words in them and different syntactic structures. And we know that humans are able to adapt to the fact that a word is more frequent in the current context than it is in general in the language. So this project is one of those frustratingly simple types of projects where the first thing that we tried ended up being very effective, so we just went with it. And what we do here is just we continue training the model on the test set. So after each sentence, we update the weights of the model and use the new weights to process the next sentence. That's it. It's very simple, and it works very well. So we tested it on a small corpus with 10 different stories from 2 different genres. And we found that this simple adaptation mechanism reduced perplexity quite significantly when we switched from Wikipedia, which is the genre that the model was trained on, to whatever it is that the model was reading at that point. So this is maybe not surprising, but I mean, the fact that such a simple adaptation mechanism is so effective, I think, is quite interesting. But what I want to show here is how we can use this adaptation as a way to understand what the model is representing. So let's say that we're interested in whether the model is adapting not just to the words that tend to occur in the current text, but also to the syntax. Let's say that we're in a text that tends to use a lot of passive verbs, and maybe when we start reading the text, we don't expect to have a lot of passive verbs, but then we gradually grow to expect that. So the way that we tested it is inspired by this idea of syntactic priming. Let's give the model a number of adaptation sentences that have one syntactic structure, and let's see if the model grows to expect this syntactic structure. And the way that we can control for structure versus vocabulary is by using these two constructions that have the same meaning but different syntax. So in dative sentences, you can say the boy gave the girl the toy, or the boy gave the toy to the girl. These two sentences mean the same thing but have different syntax and have almost exactly the same words. And we know that when a human reads sentences that has one of these structures, they become more likely to expect the same structure to occur next. So we took a language model that was trained on Wikipedia, and we threw in the adaptation set a bunch of sentences that have this structure: the boy threw the dog a ball. And then after adapting to these sentences, we tested it on two classes of sentences. one sentence is one class is when the syntactic structure is exactly the same, but all of the words are different, right? So we train it on the boy threw the dog a ball, and we test it on the captain mailed the student a letter. So if perplexity goes down on this sentence, it suggests that the model adapted to syntax because none of the words are the same words. And we can also test it on sentences that have exactly the same words as in training, but different syntactic structure, right? So then we have this nice dissociation between adapting to words and adapting to syntax. And what we found is that the model adapted to both, which I thought was nice. So it generalizes from one sentence with a given syntactic structure to another sentence with the same structure but totally different words. So this was this is something that a method that we can use to test what similarity metric the model has between two sentences. So if the model has thinks that two sentences are similar because they have the same syntactic structure or similar syntactic structure, that is interesting. It shows that the model has syntactic, cares about syntax. OK, so that was a bit quick, and I think I will have to end in a sec. So I will skip the last. I can talk to you about it later, but this is the project where we break NLI systems by, this is like a high accuracy, reasonably high accuracy NLI systems. And we just tested whether they tend to think that a sentence entails all of its subsequences. So whether the sentence, Alice believes Mary is lying, entails Alice believes Mary. Or the book on the table is blue, the table is blue. So this is actually a heuristic that works in a lot of cases, but you can definitely find cases in which it doesn't work and see whether the model thinks that there's an entailment relation that holds between them. And the answer is yes. So I'll skip the, if you exclude sentences with negation words, which is another heuristic that it uses, you get accuracy that's very, very close to 0%, regardless of the pre-training tasks that they use. So these are a number of different pre-training tasks that we use. OK, so that was a 1-minute presentation of this paper. And just to conclude, what I was trying to say is that RNNs and language models and other systems can succeed on the average sentence and applied task without really mastering the phenomena that we think someone should or a system should master. So that can be properly understanding syntax or not using heuristics like a sentence entails all of its subsequences, which are heuristic that work in a large % of the cases, but they're clearly not the right thing. So we can fool ourselves into thinking that the model is learned to do inference, whereas it just learns a bunch of heuristics that are not the heuristics, not the relevant rules. And in syntax in particular, we found that LSTMs can approximate syntactic behavior even without a bias, and it's not easy to trick them. But if you work hard enough, you are able to trick them, especially if you construct these sentences yourself. And well, there's a question of how do we make LCMs better and such that they are able to perform these tasks the way that we would like. And multitask learning helps a little bit. Explicitly modeling syntax can also help. So teaching the language model that it needs to parse a sentence, even without explicit supervision of what the parse is, just having the bias that you want to parse the sentence, you want to reach some kind of parse can help. But I think that at this point, none of the methods we have bring our language models to the level that they can perform as well as humans do on the tasks that I suggested here. All right, thank you.